Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's event on Sino-US relationship over the next 4 years with Dean Wu Xinbo from Fudan University. The event is organized by the Center on Contemporary China and the World, known as the CCCW. I'm Li Chen, director of CCCW and a professor in the Department of Politics and Public Administration. There's no better timing to talk about the impact of American presidential election. As the world is still trying to grapple with the re-election of Donald Trump and its implications, today we have the privilege to hear the Chinese perspective from Professor Wu Xinbo, who is undoubtedly one of China's foremost experts on the subject. Professor Wu is the Dean of the Institute of International Studies and the Director of the Center for American Studies at Fudan University. His contribution to the field of Sino-US relations and his interactions with the Chinese policy elites are both profound and far-reaching. As a member of the advisory board to the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Professor Wu is an essential voice within China's policymaking landscape, providing invaluable guidance on navigating the complexity of US-China relations in today's global arena. Professor Wu is also no stranger to the Washington policy community, and having spent time at the leading American think tanks and universities, including 8 months long visiting scholarship at the Brookings Institution in the year 2000. But my association and friendship with Wu Xinbo began even earlier. I think it's 1993 and 1995 when I was visiting scholar at the Fudan. You were a young assistant professor there. Professor Wu's rare combination of the deep academic expertise and the practical policy insight has positioned him as a bridge between Chinese and American academic and the policy communities. His presence today underscores CCCW's commitment to fostering an in-depth discussion on global challenges and engaging with thought leaders who shape the world we live in. We are also delighted to be joined by the moderator of the lecture, Dr. Austin Stranger, an associate professor in the Department of Politics and Public Administration, and one of our CCCW senior fellows. With a PhD in political science from Harvard, Austin's research focuses on Chinese foreign policy, international political economy, and international development. As you can see, today's discussion is between a Chinese scholar who studies US and an American scholar who studies China. We will all see that so what one of them has to say about the other's home country, and if the other person agrees. Now, please note that today's event is on the record. And there are a lot of journalists from China, Hong Kong, and also overseas. And all of you welcome to use the information talked about in the event. Feel free to take photos during the event, but no videos are allowed. We will have our official video posted a few days after the event. And Professor Wu will give a presentation for about 20 minutes, and followed by a discussion with my colleague, Austin. And I apologize, I have another online meeting with the South Korea Prime Minister and also Daniel Russell and Neil Ferguson. They're still on. I need to join to prevent what I believe the Chinese perspective. So I have to excuse myself. And after that conversation between Austin and Dean Wu, we will open to the floor for audience questions. Now, please join me, warmly welcome Professor Wu Xinbo.
Thank you, Li Chen, for your kind invitation and very generous introduction. Good morning, everyone. Well, if at Fudan University we start an event at 9 o'clock in the morning, that's a big risk. But this is Hong Kong, so very surprised. I'm thinking about my first encountering with Li Chen when he just graduated from Princeton University, right? A fresh PhD and coming to Fudan University as a visiting scholar. That was in the early 1990s. So almost 3 decades, we have seen Li Chen's development as a world-renowned scholar on China and China-US relations. I think it's very important for Li Chen to move back to Greater China, to Hong Kong. I believe the CCCW is going to play a very crucial role in facilitating the dialogue across the Pacific and also worldwide. So it's a great honor for me to visit the center today and have a chance to exchange views with you. Now, today's topic is about the prospects of Sino-US relations. But I want to start by sharing some of my thoughts on Donald Trump's political return and the implications for the United States. Because 8 years ago, when Trump won the election, it was a big surprise to us, to many people. And over the past 80 years, we kept wondering whether the Trump phenomena is an episode or a trend, a political trend. Now, with his political return, I think the answer is very clear. Trump phenomena is not something that will last for a very short period of time. It's going to be a prevailing trend shaping the US in the years to come. Now, then I began to think about what happened, what developments make Trump's rise inevitable. Think about my study of the United States in the last 3 decades. This year is actually the 30th anniversary of my first visit to the United States. In 1994, I went to the United States, George Washington University, as a visiting scholar for 1 year. And in the next 3 decades, I visited the US many, many times, almost every year, except for the pandemic period. And I also spent several years in Washington, D.C. for an extended period. Now, thinking about the last 3 decades, I think I have experienced 3 different Americas. Okay, the first America, that was in the 1990s. That was a very optimistic and confident, self-confident America. The Cold War was over. The US was only remaining superpower. And Americans believe that with the end of Cold War, the prospects are bright for America and the world. So the first National Security Strategy report released by the Clinton administration, the 2 key words, engagement and enlargement. US was to engage the entire world, including its former adversaries, China, Russia, and other countries. And also the US was going to enlarge its strategic perimeter to every corner of the world. US was going to promote globalization, was going to repair and reestablish international regimes and norms. US was going to provide public goods to the world. So that was the America I first encountered when I arrived in Washington in January 1994. But then in the next decade, I saw a different America. this America is featured by, I would say, a frustrated and angry America. Everything started in the wake of September 11th terrorist attack. And in the next 2 years, the US was frustrated by 2 wars, Iraq war, Afghanistan war, and one crisis. That's the US financial crisis break up in 2008. Many of my American friends felt angry at what happened because, around the year 2000, the US was really at the peak of its development for decades. But now, all of a sudden, in 1 decade's time, the US was terribly hit by strategic blunders and serious economic crisis, the most serious economic crisis since 1930s. It was this kind of mood that brought Obama, the first black president, to power. Okay, Obama won the election in 2008, largely because of this kind of strong sentiment in the United States. So this is the second America. The third America was in the second decade of 21st century. That is, I would call a divided and antagonistic America. From Obama to Donald Trump, what we saw is in the US is political polarization, social division, culture war, clash of values. It was this strong mood that contributed to the rise of Donald Trump. To some extent, the rise of Obama led to the rise of Donald Trump. Now, if you look at the second decade, the 2 wars and 1 crisis, from hindsight, this could have been avoided. They were terrible strategic and policy mistakes, but they were not inevitable. If the US had smarter leaders at that time, they could avoid the 2 wars. So it was not inevitable. But for the third decade, a divided and antagonist America, to some extent, that was structural. That had to do with the demographic change in the United States, to the clash of values, to the cultural war, and to the conflict of interests. Because globalization, the US is in itself a major beneficiary of globalization. However, the interests are not evenly distributed. You have losers and gains, people who gain from it. So that creates this kind of frictions. So think about Donald Trump and Trumpism. I think he was very smart by capturing this mood in the United States, the concern over the loss of the dominant position of the white people. Okay, the concern over the diverse culture and value ideas, the concern over the inflow of illegal immigrants. All this kind of social political mood led to the rise of Donald Trump. And I think this is going to last for many years to come, Okay, then let me move to China-US relations. Again, put in a broad historical context, I think it was Donald Trump's first term really studied the turning point of China-US relations. Before Donald Trump, the US-China relations was largely featured by cooperation. If you look at bilateral economic relations, that was very clear. It just keep growing since 1979, all the way to 2016, 2017. until Donald Trump started the tariff war. In those years, there were differences between two countries. I mean, even crises like embassy bombing, EP3, aircraft crash. But Beijing and Washington were able to manage those differences and crises to make sure these relations can keep growing. However, starting from 2018, we entered a period featured by so-called competition and conflict. And the US decided that it's no longer a good idea to engage a rising China, because a rising China is poised to challenge America's hegemonic position. Very simple logic. So in the last 8 years, either Donald Trump or Joe Biden, they almost followed the same China policy. That is fierce strategic competition and trying to slow down China's growth and, if possible, disrupt China's development as the next superpower in their world. So in spite of the conflict in Ukraine, in spite of the conflict in the Middle East, policymakers in Washington believe China remains the primary strategic competitor to the US in the long term. In the short term, the US has to deal with Russia, deal with the Middle East. But in the long term, China is the main adversary, and for some people, enemy. Now, with Donald Trump's return to White House, what will happen in the next 4 years? If anything we can tell about Donald Trump, that's his unpredictability, right? So as we learned from his first term. But still, I'm trying to come up with 3 different scenarios for China-US relations in the next 4 years, starting with the best one. Okay. Scenario 1, we are going to see tensions across the board. Economic relations, diplomatic relations, security relations. Trump and his team will push China and tension will arise. However, Donald Trump may still want to make a deal with China, mostly on the economic front, but also in other areas, diplomatic areas. So there's a limit about how far they want to push the envelope in relation with China. So yes, tension will arise, but we can avoid a showdown. We can avoid a conflict, a major conflict. So, and at the end of the day, we can make a deal with Donald Trump. So I think that is the best scenario. Second scenario, Trump will push China across the board, but in 1 or 2 particular areas, there may be some serious conflict. For example, on the economic front, if the US is going to impose up to 60% of tariffs on all the imports from China, which was about $450 million last year. Okay. And then will impose more sanctions on Chinese entities and also tighten the technology flow to China, intensify the crackdown on China's technological development. I think economic relations, economic ties will suffer greatly because China will retaliate. Okay, so we will say, the single most important pillar underpinning today's China-US relations will be seriously hurt. Okay, so we will see the conflict in the economic area. China may lose 60%, 70% of its export to the US, lose the US market, 60, 70%, depending on how high the tariff rate will be. And of course, US will also suffer greatly. Think about the US agricultural products selling to China, the Chinese export of rare earth material to the US, many other equipments, products that US still relies on Chinese market. So when we say the US-China economic ties seriously damaged, there could be spillover into other areas, diplomatic, political areas, because some of Trump's senior aides, some are already nominated, some are yet to come. They are not just economic hawks, they are also ideological and geopolitical hawks on China. So they are going to push on human rights, democracy, value, Taiwan, South China Sea, you name it. So we will see multiple points of clashes between two countries. But still, in this case, we are not going to enter a major military conflict. That's the bottom line. Because I believe Trump, as he tells, honestly tells, he doesn't like war. I believe him. So the bottom line is that no war between China and the United States. Okay, so that is the second scenario. The worst case scenario is that some military crisis and even conflict may occur between two sides. In Taiwan Strait, or in South China Sea, or in other parts of the Western Pacific. Why would this happen? My logic is that if Donald Trump had not get the concessions from China, he would go mad, and then he will let his senior aides to do whatever they want to do on relation with China. And you have people like, maybe I should mention his name, but he's already nominated as Secretary of State. You know who he is, right? I mean, these people, they really want to challenge China's political system. They really want to normalize US relations with Taiwan. I mean, which are certainly the red lines for China-US relations. So what you can expect is very fierce response from China. The tension will go very, very high between two sides, especially on the military side. So that is not something Trump wants to get, but at a certain point, he may give those hawks a free hand to do whatever they want to do. Just like in 2020, when Trump feared that he was going to lose the campaign and he blamed China for the COVID, he just let people like Pompeo do whatever you want to do with China, politically, diplomatically, on the military side. And there will be a kind of, free falling of this relationship. That's my real concern. So, I think we already have the time limit. So let me very quick in wrapping up my opening remarks. What China should do? What China should do? We have gained some experiences in dealing with Trump in his first term. So this time, I think we are better prepared to deal with him in his second term. We should try to engage him more proactively and especially reach out to Trump himself, because this is going to be a government that only one person counts. That's Donald Trump. And the good news is that he still views President Xi as his good friend and repeatedly expressing his respect for President Xi. So if we think about, a possible summit between two leaders soon after Trump enters White House, that should not be a bad idea, right? So reach out to Donald Trump himself as early as possible at the highest level. Second, China should prepare for a very hard bargaining with Trump, starting from economic area. I still believe Trump wants to get a deal, a good deal, of course, for him. So he would try to squeeze as much as he can. So China has to painfully, engage him in a very intense wrist wrestling, right? If there's a red word to call. But finally, hopefully we can still make a deal. Okay. Thirdly, China should also prepare for a fight. I'm not mean military fight. I hope not. What I mean is that if we cannot make a deal, Trump will say, okay, 60% tariff on products from China, removing normal trade relations status for China. Okay. If not cut off, but drastically diminish the people-to-people exchanges between our two countries. China has to prepare for that kind of situation. And we should have some ammunitions in place to shoot back. So I think the first 6 months of next year will be crucial. It will largely determine which path this relationship will take and which of the three scenarios I have just mentioned will materialize. So with that, I will stop here with my opening remarks. Thank you.
Yes. Okay. So.
Did I speak too loud?
Not at all. I think everybody wants to hear from you. Hello?
Your question.
That's right. Good morning, everyone. Thank you all for coming. Thank you to CCCW and Professor Li Cheng, who had to step out temporarily, and to Professor Wu Xinbo for joining us for an extremely important conversation. I think you're very brave, commenting on how things may go just a week or two after the election. So I think this is why you can get people to come here on a Monday morning. Everybody wants these answers. So thank you for joining us. I think these remarks are extremely helpful. I think it really makes sense to provide background and historical context for this issue rather than just jumping into who are the Trump's potential advisors going to be and what is concretely going to happen. I think the context is absolutely critical if you really want to understand broader trends and why we're seeing the things that we do. So I just want to say thank you for getting the conversation started by by adding that context. So I'll add a few of my own thoughts, but I'm going to keep them very brief, and then I'll ask you a couple questions just to get the conversation started. But I'm hoping we can use most of our time to have a discussion together. And I want to pick up with this context and sort of lead it up into what we now know about the outcome of the U.S. election and starting to think about what this might mean for U.S.-China relations. Again, I think you're providing this sort of evolution of American politics is really important if you want to understand the rise of Trump and the evolution of the Republican Party over the last few administrations. I think additionally, as much as U.S.-China relations are really important, what we've seen, I think, in America and in American politics over the past couple of decades, of course, is not a uniquely American story either, right? We've seen lots of uneven effects of globalization all over the world, and the U.S. is a big and important chapter of that, but it's certainly not the whole story. So we can even package all of this in a global context as well. And I think so why do I think this is so important? When we come back to the U.S. and China in the second Trump administration, for me, and again, I'm very cautious about making any predictions about what is going to happen for the reasons you've laid out. Trump is, one of the less predictable politicians we've ever seen. However, I think there's a key fault line emerging that is going to decide a lot of this. And I think you already started to hit at this in your remarks, Professor Wu. What is this fault line? How much of Trump's approach and the Trump administration's approach towards China is going to be systematically directed at China versus how much of it is going to be packaged within an America First policy that is primarily focused on the U.S. economy and focusing on the optics of the U.S. economy as well. How much is this going to be about systematic competition with China versus just thinking more about the U.S., putting the U.S. first in all international situations? I think that's a really important distinction. And this is why the appointments in the Trump administration, we do need to watch them very closely. So some of these individuals, as you suggested, do believe very strongly in this systemic competition narrative with China. They are thinking across the board. They are going to try to hit China hard on sensitive issues like human rights and democracy and political issues, in addition to the huge economic tensions. I think other potential advisors in the Trump administration will be much more business friendly when it comes to China, right? And I think this is going to be a key source of elite conflict. And I certainly could be wrong. When we have a group discussion, I'd be interested if anybody disagrees with this. But right now, the way this is shaping up, this seems like a huge fault line that is going to affect how much of U.S. policy over the next 4 years towards China is packaged within this systemic competitor narrative that has sort of coalesced over the past 8 years in a bilateral sense, versus how much of this is just going to be focusing on getting good deals around the world for the U.S. economy. So you mentioned, I'll mention his name, even though you did, Marco Rubio. We would put him in the.
Okay.
I said that. I'm happy. I'm comfortable saying that. So Marco Rubio, given his past statements and rhetoric, we would think of him as someone who would be systemically hawkish, right, on China. There are lots of potential advisors going into the cabinet and other important political positions, political appointees that may not fall into that category. And there's been a lot of interesting conversations about Elon Musk, for example. So far, it seems like he might be, with this new government efficiency initiative, if it materializes, he might be focused more on domestic politics. He's also been sitting in on foreign policy meetings as well. So this isn't suggesting that I have any idea how this is going to go. I'm simply pointing out that even though the Republicans have taken the executive branch and both parts of Congress, I think the assumption there is that, or sort of the implicit tendency is to think, well, we should expect a really unified front when it comes to Trump's policy on China. Trump has immense power and he can do whatever he wants. But I do believe within his advisory circle, there may be a lot of division. And so I think that's a huge source of uncertainty. And I think this directly relates to the context that Professor Wu was talking about, uneven effects from globalization, winners and losers of globalization, people sitting in very different positions when they think about the U.S. and China and the world. One more comment, and then I just want to raise a question or two. I think there has been a tendency, certainly in recent weeks, and for obvious reasons, we've had a big election in the US, to put American politics front and center. One thing, though, I think we should avoid is just thinking about China in sort of this reactive way. China's government in this position of trying to figure out what the United States, what's going to happen with the Trump administration and what the US is going to do. These are two superpowers. And I think we run the risk of really neglecting China's strategic choices if we only look at what's happening in the United States. So I was glad you brought this up, in the concluding part of your remarks. From where I sit as an outsider, this is what I would say are sort of status quo policy orientations for the PRC. I think it would be a good thing from China's perspective if the relationship could be healthier and more stable. I think China has made its preference for that very clear. I think there's certainly a perception, and I think it's very fair, that the tensions we've seen in the past decade, this was mainly a choice of the United States, right? And a lot of this started with the trade war and the escalation of tensions around 2015, 2016, end of the Obama administration, beginning of the Trump administration. And so I don't necessarily think that means we have to think of Chinese foreign policy in a reactive way. I think China's government has coalesced on the notion that it needs to increase its self-reliance. It needs to be more resilient against potential external threats like U.S., escalation of economic or other types of tough policies. As you said, I think China's government knows that it needs to be ready to fight back. When this happens, if tariffs increase by 60%, I'm sure that China has been preparing for this for months, if not longer. A series of retaliatory measures, just as we saw in the first Trump administration. And I think China's government also thinks, and it's actively been doing this, it needs to look beyond the United States as well. And I think, regions like, different parts of the global South, different countries within, different regions of Europe. Again, we need to put U.S.-China relations in a global context as well, because this isn't just a two-player game. And so I think that's an important part of the discussion that we need to add in, even though there's all this emphasis right now on what is happening with the Trump administration and what is U.S. policy going to coalesce on. So that's just a couple of more contextual points. I wanted to start with a question for you, Professor Wu, which is, in the United States, and I think you know this just as well as I do because you're an expert in U.S. politics. If you go to D.C. these days, there is an extremely strong, what we've been calling a China consensus, right? There's a sort of a bipartisan, across the aisle consensus that increasingly the U.S. and China are in a systemic competition that seeps into lots of different policy areas. There are minority viewpoints. That's not the only viewpoint. But my assessment of the situation is that it's really difficult for these alternative viewpoints to be heard for a number of reasons. Some people are very hesitant to voice them. Certainly within U.S. politics, being tough on China is one of the easiest things you can do politically these days, and it has been for the past 5 or 10 years. But even at the think tank and the academic level as well, I think it's become increasingly difficult to sort of voice alternative viewpoints. But I wanted to start this off, because you're coming to us from Shanghai, by flipping this question and looking at the China context. So you're the director of the Center for American Studies at Fudan. You know this community of China America watchers very well, probably as well as anyone. And I'm curious on how this space is evolving. Do you think that there is still a strong diversity in viewpoints at either a policy or an intellectual level? Are there any concerns, similarly to the U.S. situation, about groupthink and this idea that there are certain policy orientations towards the United States that are now becoming more politically correct, that it makes sense for both senior and junior scholars, researchers, and certainly government officials to sort of advocate for? I guess the broader question is, as someone who doesn't know as much about this, how has the space in China for America watching changed? And I guess I would add on to that, given what's happened with the U.S. election, do you foresee any changes moving forward? So I'm hoping we could start there and then maybe open it up.
I'm not prepared for this question, but it's a very good question.
I think you're the most prepared, certainly more than any of us. So
I think certainly you can feel the change in the mood within the community about China-US relations. I mean, simply look at the research agenda of my colleagues. 10 years ago, most of our focus was still, how we could expand the areas of cooperation between China and US, not only bilaterally, but more and more multilaterally, global governance, right? So the focus was more on the positive side, cooperation, or managing differences, solving problems, get relations moving forward. But in the last 10 years, you see more and more attention geared toward competition, rivalry, and crisis management, even, conflict studies. So this can tell, how the changing relations between two countries have reshaped the research agenda of our community. There are still different voices, of course. Some people believe this relationship, even though more and more strained, is still manageable. If we look at the trade ties between two countries, we look at the people-to-people exchanges, and we don't think a new Cold War is going to take place between our two countries. So that is the one, I think, mainstream view. Okay. But there is another rising voice which says, don't be naive, guys. The US has changed its China policy not tactically, but strategically. If you said the change was caused by Trump, why Biden didn't reverse it, right? That means there has been a bipartisan consensus on US-China policy. So we have to prepare for a very different era of China-US relations, which is being featured by growing competition, rivalry, and preparations on both sides for the worst-case scenario in the Western Pacific. So that is something we have to face up to the voice. I think the second voice is getting more weight as bilateral relations, continue to move on a very turbulent path. Yeah. So basically, that's two voices. I think both, to some extent, I would say both are mainstream views. Yeah.
Thank you. That's a really helpful answer. I just want to make one more quick comment, and then we'll open it up. So that's a very helpful response. And as you were speaking, I was just thinking, our immediate business here is to try to sort through what is going to happen in the next 4 years. Again, what is changing in US politics, what's changing in Chinese politics. But I also think, again, when we consider context, I do think that the general trajectory of this relationship over the past decade or so, and as you said, this trajectory is, even in all your scenarios, is pretty likely to continue, right? General tensions across the board, the degree of which remains to be seen. This has been a long-term shift. I think this has a couple of important effects that are difficult to quantify, but are really important. The first one is that certainly if I were the Chinese government, I would have no way to trust the United States government anymore, regardless of who the next leadership administration is. So I think there's going to be a long-term strategic trust deficit that, again, you can, with each administration, you can try to chip away at that and repair that with all types of diplomatic and other channels. I think the Biden administration has done an okay job of that on the U.S. side. But every 4 years, there's a risk that you may have to do some of that again. So I think there is going to be a major trust deficit for a long time. Even if relations get better, it's going to take a lot of investment to try to fix that. Relatedly, particularly for young people in both of these countries, and I know this very well on the US side, there's also going to be a huge gap in people who are coming up and having their formative years, right? And including probably many of you in the audience, in a period during which the relationship between these two very important countries is stable. And so worldviews of, hopefully a lot of you will go on to be very influential in the world someday. Worldviews of millions of people on both sides of this relationship are going to be formed, at least in part, during this period of tensions. And so I think there's a lot more to sort through in the longer term beyond just sort of what the policies are going to be. And that's going to take a lot of time. So I've talked enough. Why don't we open it up, and I'll moderate. And if you have a question, I would just ask to raise your hand and try to use the microphone. And please identify yourself so we know who you are. Thank you. Yeah, let's start over here.
Here,
Yes.
I'm Jennifer Jett from NBC. To the point about putting this in broader global context, I wanted to ask about Europe. Europe is obviously very close to the US, but it seems like the Trump administration will be less focused on Europe and want to focus more on China. And at the same time, Europe has a very important economic relationship with China. Are they going to be caught in the middle between the US and China, or will they try to forge their own path with Beijing? And what role, if any, could Europe play in shaping US-China relations in the next 4 years?
I think, is this on? Is it? Okay, good. Europe is going to be impacted in two ways with the return of Donald Trump. One is that the right-wing political parties may gain more momentum in the next several years. So that will reshape the political landscape, not in small countries, but in major countries in Europe. You guys know what I mean. Okay, election in the next 2 years. So that's something some Europeans very much worry about. Okay. Second, yes, China, US. I think to some extent, this may be a good news for Europe, because Donald Trump, unlike the Biden administration, he wouldn't care that much about, rallying allies around the US against China. He pushing, Netherlands, Germany, you guys have to stop selling certain, stuff to China. Instead, Trump was going to, punch on that. So that will somehow loosen up this kind of coalition, transatlantic coalition against China. And that will give Europeans more leeway in managing their relations with China. This, to some extent, is already happening. If you see, in the last several months, the European political figures, foreign ministers, presidents, prime ministers, travel to China, to Beijing, trying to strengthen ties, not just economic ties, but also diplomatic ties with Beijing to prepare for Donald Trump's return. So on the part of China, Austin just mentioned that Beijing, when dealing with the US, we also think about this in a broader context, right? If there'll be more tariffs from the US, we can think about more ambitious trade and investment initiatives towards Europe and other parts of the world. So yes, politically, Europe will be impacted by the return of Donald Trump. Diplomatically, I think that gives Europe an opportunity to repair and reboost relations with China, especially if we can see an ending, if not, formal ending of the conflict in Ukraine. Okay, yeah.
Yes, just introduce yourself. Thanks.
My name is Kuhn. I actually am. I research and facilitate US-China people-to-people relations. I'm also the only foreign member at various think tanks and student organizations like CIS Youth. You mentioned in the talk that China has to prepare for a reduction of China-US people-to-people exchanges relations. I was wondering, what does that look like? What does such a reduction actually look like? And what will be its impact? And also at places like that you lead at Fudan University's Center for America Studies. And to which extent does that mean that the security communities on both sides will start playing a larger role if we see less people-to-people exchanges, research centers? What does such a securitization and the security community taking over then the relations to a large extent to it? How do you see it? Thank you.
Well, a major concern is that in the second Trump administration, they may limit the issuing of visa to Chinese students majoring in STEM in universities. Okay, so actually, I mean, the Biden administration already began to think about this. At Fudan University, I always get asked by my students, whether they should think about going to US to pursue graduate studies in medicine, in engineering, in science. I think they are now they become very, I mean, in the past, it's not touching at all. But now they become very hesitant. So actually, in the last 2 years, there has been 20-30% drop in Fudan University students, going to study in the US compared with the, pre-COVID period. So students already began to make a different choice given the city in this relationship. But overall, the number of Chinese students studying in the US, the number is still big, close to 300,000. The big change in the last several years is really the declining number of American students coming to study in China. There used to be, 15,000 to 20,000. That was the regular size. But today, maybe 1,000, 2,000. In my class, European students, Asian students are very quick to return. American students are very slow, largely because, the State Department put on this travel advisory, level 3. You have to reconsider going to China because of the risk. I mean, that is ridiculous, right? However, if Trump comes back, there may be more discouraging message for American students to come to study China. This summer, we had a group of students from Harvard University. They came to our center for the summer school, and they stayed in Shanghai for 6 weeks, attending lectures and, traveling around, not just in Shanghai, but also in the neighboring Zhejiang and Jiangsu province. Half of the students, this was their first time in China. They found it very eye-opening because very different from what they learned in the US. What they learned in the US is that China is a repressive, right, dangerous country. People all hate Americans. Okay, that's what they learned, right? But then they come to Fudan, they engage our students at campus. They ate in the cafeteria. They travel around to the business community, local district. They found very diverse attitudes toward the US, right? Some students say, oh, I'm thinking about applying for US universities for my graduate studies. Some businessmen say, oh, US is my major business partner, okay? some people say, maybe I want to, move to the US to stay there for several years. Okay. So very diverse. I think what we need to do is how to get more and more American youth to China. So that's what we should do.
I would just quickly add a couple of points on that. So I agree with everything Professor Wu said. We might actually even see the number of U.S. students, this is more on the American side, number of U.S. students in China, as you pointed out, is already so low that it's difficult for things to sort of bottom out further. The travel advisory level 3 is a really big deal, I think. I think I've heard this repeatedly in conversations with Chinese counterparts. And so if there were a way for this to be negotiated with the new administration coming in, this would be, so I think people-to-people exchanges is, despite everything that's going on, this is the one area where we should try to be optimistic when we can. If we're going to start somewhere, I think this is this should be relatively low-hanging fruit, even though it has become increasingly strained. So I also think it's important to distinguish the different types of people-to-people exchanges, right? So you have young people, and certainly I think China's government has made it clear that it does want to get more young Americans to China. It's taken some steps to make that easier, but it's extremely difficult to do that with the travel advisory because this creates huge insurance and other risk basically for American universities that would sponsor study abroad programs and things like that. Relatedly, I think American scholars and intellectuals and other professionals who would also, be really important actors in sort of this, lower level, but nonetheless important actors in this story of U.S.-China relations. This is also an extremely strained group, partly because of the same reason, but also because of concerns about the ability to do research, for example, in China as well. So anyway, I think this is an important starting point, and hopefully on the U.S. side, the travel advisory can be revisited at some point. Yes.
Thank you so much, Professor Wu and Dr. Stranger. I think it's really important to give us the whole perspective about what Chinese academic really think about the U.S.-China relations in the next 4 years. I'm a reporter from South China Morning Post. My name is Zhao Ziwen. And I think my question is still about Taiwan. I think everybody is thinking about it. We can see that until now, we can't exactly see what Washington will do in the next 4 years because we can see Trump saying something like Taiwan should pay defense bill or Taiwan's chip industry is still Americans' money or something like that. But we can still see, like you said, the Mark Rubio and other China hawks, they really want to establish some formal relations with Taiwan. And we can see this kind of unclear or even dual dynamic inside Washington and even inside Taiwan. There's a lot of debate about what American will do in the next 4 years. So my question is that from China's side, how do you evaluate Americans' policy on Taiwan in the next 4 years? And are we going to see the so-called worst scenario and what China should do to avoid or even face the so-called worst scenario? Thank you.
If you look at the U.S. defense doctrine, the key word on China is deterrence. Deterrence what? They want to deter China from solving the Taiwan issue by the use of force. That suggests the U.S. is not willing to fight a war with China over Taiwan. So they hope, this will not happen. So that gives me some optimism that the U.S. military, they want to hold on to the bottom line of no military conflict in the Taiwan Strait, in spite of what other political figures may propose. Because at the end of the day, the voices from different sectors within the government, military, intelligence, diplomacy, econ, they all go to the president, and the president has to make the decision, right? If this is going to risk a war with China, the president has to ask the military, are you guys ready for that? So that's a hope. that a military conflict across the Taiwan Strait could be avoided if the US acts carefully. But there's another danger that some people in Taiwan, you just mentioned the internal dynamics in Taiwan, DPP government, they may view this, people like Rubio, their good friend, as a great opportunity. So they would push the envelope and create a crisis in the Taiwan Strait. That's another possibility. And whether or not Washington can really rein in these adventures coming from Taiwan is a big question. Okay.
Thank you very much, Professor Wu. I have two questions. I'm Peter.
Long time no see.
Long time no see, in decades. I'm Peter Cheng in the Department of Politics and Public Admin. Two quick questions. The first one is, I would echo Austin's statement that China has many instruments and policies that it can use and influence the United States as well. I think over a whole range of international issues, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Korea, armament, military, and Middle East, whatever. I think, what do you think are the very important strategic tools or instruments that China can consider to influence the United States? Of course, there's the factor of Donald Trump, and you mentioned one just a minute ago, and that is to use personal diplomacy. There are many things that China can do, in order to shape U.S. foreign policy. And tell us a bit more about this. The second one is, of course, I hope our chief executive would be here. He would be delighted to see your assessment on the impact on Hong Kong, because U.S. sanctions against American companies has hugely adversely affected Hong Kong. Very serious, and not to mention other measures Donald Trump has taken. So how would you, tell us a little bit more about how Hong Kong would be affected by Donald Trump administration? Thank you.
Aside from the economic and trade area, other things Trump may want to get China's help. First and foremost will be the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I think the Trump team these days must be thinking very seriously about how to bring an end to this conflict. And as the process starts, they would like to get China's involvement in some ways, given China's relations with Russia. So this is kind of like the priority of North Korean issue during Trump's first term, right? And then, of course, Korean Peninsula. North Korea, as we can tell, is drawing closer and closer to Russia. And Americans began to worry about it. The last time when I was in Washington, people say, well, in the past, we know the advice from Beijing to Pyongyang is that stay calm, we prefer peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula, no conflict. But if Putin is going to provide advice to Pyongyang, that may be different. So yes, after Ukraine, Trump may try to reach out to Pyongyang again. If Pyongyang doesn't want to, challenge Trump's priority, by taking some drastic actions in the next 1 month, but not so sure. Middle East, of course. I'm concerned that the conflict may escalate in the Middle East because some people in Washington, they really want to encourage Israel to escalate the conflict with Iran. That will get the situation out of control. And I think China, given its rising influence in the region, can play some constructive role. So at least 3 hotspots, I think the US has to work with China. As for Hong Kong, I'm going to talk to the senior government officials in Hong Kong this afternoon. I think they will ask the same questions. I think Hong Kong should do its best, trying to stay out of this, spiral downturn trend in this relationship. Ideally, Hong Kong can still act as some kind of, connecting point across the Pacific, including just you mentioned, if less and less American students going to study in the mainland, they can still come to Hong Kong, right? You have so many Chinese students from the mainland, you can still meet, engage here. So I would prefer Hong Kong staying out of this kind of entanglements and play a more constructive role. Yes.
Yes, please.
That currently America is seeing a further split or divide among the capitalists. So with one string is those capitalists that represent or who are the actual beneficiaries from globalization. So those who promote globalization, and another string are those who are like local capitals who resist globalization. So Trump's rise actually signifies kind of like the rise of those local capitalists who resist globalization. But at the same time, we also know that, for those multinational corporations who really have an interest in the Chinese market, so they may probably further be engaged with China. So given this split, and so how would you foresee maybe possible future China-US directions? Because, some capitalists, right, multinational corporations may still want to be engaged with China, but yeah. So thank you.
You're correct. The U.S. business community doing business in China these days are very nervous because they think Trump's return and the possible worsening of this relationship will put the business operation in China in a very difficult situation. China may retaliate against the U.S. by, imposing more restrictions on U.S. companies doing business in China, and China may provide more favorable policies to their competitors from Europe, for example. So I think the U.S. business community operating in China is now in a very difficult situation because the Trump administration tend to view them as you are not loyal to U.S. interests. You guys just want to make money, hollowing out U.S. manufacturing industry. When you make money overseas, you don't send the money back to the U.S. Those what you call I would call what Trump represents the homegrown capitalism, right? They say, these people are against U.S. interests, and we have no reason to protect them. But for China, I think Chinese government will work hard to keep them, reassure them, and if we have to retaliate against the some U.S. companies doing business in China, that will be a very selective basis, as we have seen in the past. So overall, I trust that in the next several years, there will be more ambitious agenda for further opening up for Chinese economy. So that's the good news for Europeans, for Japanese, but also for Americans. Yeah.
So we're almost out of time. There's still lots of questions. How about we take just two more, but keep them very brief.
And very simple. Okay.
And very simple, please. Okay, great. We can try to take a few more then, please. Mm-hmm.
also presents an idea of American structure or double speak that has no takers in the world or in the US anymore. So as the US and China navigate this new world and this understanding of how the world should become, is there space in the Chinese thought for a more multilateral discussion?
Just the question is sort of about Chinese perceptions of polarity. I see. Yeah, let's collect a couple more and then we'll give Professor Wu a chance to give his final thoughts. Yes.
Professor Wu. I'm actually also a you just mentioned talk that each from that China should on one hand to prepare for the hard bargain, on the other hand, we can also prepare for the violence in the last resort. And so can you go into detail that actually what China can offer for Trump to make him feel that, oh, actually that is a good deal? And on the other hand, I think you mentioned that to prepare for a fight, it may not be only in terms of military. So in other forms of competition, that in what ways can China prepare for that? Thank you.
About the evolving structure of international politics, unipolar, multipolar, or bipolar, whatever you like it. I prefer multipolar. I think it is multipolar. If you look at the structure, several power centers matter in today's world. US, of course, and China increasingly more influence. Russia is still a major power center. I mean, Russia has been underestimated, had been underestimated until the Russia-Ukraine war. We are going to see a reshaping the Eurasia security architect in the next 2 years, as you know, we are working out of the Russia-Ukraine war. So the new arrangement in Europe, I mean, the security arrangement, will reflect Russia's geopolitical interests as well as its political or strategic ambition. So Russia is back. Europe is still there. Europe is, I think the situation for Europe, both strategically and economically and even politically, is getting more and more difficult. But Europe remains a major player on world stage. So think about at least the 4 major actors. And then you have the so-called global south, right? They are projecting more influence on the political and economic front. So I think that's going to be a very fluid situation in the next decade or 2, in which all the major players and the secondary players, they are going to conduct omni-dimensional alignment, okay, not just at one dimension, but also trying to project their influence as much as they can. To some extent, I think the rise of Trump only facilitates this trend towards multipolar structure. Okay. For your question, that's a good question, but I'm afraid I cannot go into the detail. Okay. I would like to keep Washington guess what China will do.
I think we can extend by just a couple minutes and take one more question.
stage for. Thank you for Professor Wu. So just under 2 decades ago, 20 years ago, you published a book called Turbulent Water, Asia Pacific Security Strategy, the post-Cold War era. I wonder what would that book look like today if you were to write it again? And also at the same time, who do you think from the US has the biggest impact of the China-US military, whether it's the president, the commander-in-chief, or his advisor secretary, or the Pentagon, or even the Congress, as Dr. Strange pointed out that it's a Republican Congress, which is what the book is also based on as well, Bush administration, which they have to give permission to appropriate fund and declare war. Which part do you think has the biggest influence in conflict or potential conflict between China and US? Thank you.
You did a very good homework. Yes. I mean, that book was about the U.S. Asia Pacific security strategy with China as a major focus. Actually, in the last several decades, we have seen the shift in the U.S. Focus on China's military development. In the 1990s, when China started to push forward military modernization, the U.S. didn't care that much because China was too, way behind the U.S. So what the U.S. asked for is just a little bit more transparency. Just let us know what kind of capability you want to develop. That's it. They don't care about, your capability because, big gap. Then, starting from George W. Bush administration, the U.S. began to take China's military modernization more seriously. And I still remember U.S. Secretary of Defense at that time, Rumsfeld. He asked, China, you were not threatened by anybody. Why would you seek to develop this kind of major capabilities, right? So they want to, slow down the growth in China's military capability. That's the second stage. Now it's in the third stage because militarily China has become much more capable. And the US began to wonder how you are going to use your growing capability. Will that be in the Taiwan Strait or in South China Sea or in, beyond the Pacific? That's something dominates the military planning for China these days. Okay, that shows that the U.S. military capability in this region has, to some extent, driven by China's defense modernization and shift in the balance of power between two countries. Yeah, to some extent, I think today we feel more confident in dealing with the security equation between China and US. Yeah.
So I think there are enough questions to go for another hour. Unfortunately, we cannot do that, so we need to stop here. Professor Wu, first of all, thank you again for visiting us and for giving this talk. And as I said at the beginning, for providing this context for what will be a very long discussion of the next 4 years. So thank you very much. And thank you all again for coming. It's particularly on a Monday morning. It's great to see so many of you here. We really appreciate it. My last duty as moderator is to give you the mascot of CCCW.
Okay.
So this is from Professor Li Cheng and his colleagues for you.
Always ready for your kids.
We need a line photo.
Okay.
So we take it out of the wrapping? Or?
Wrapper is fine.
Wrappers, okay. Great. That was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you。我回去我那个照片弄好，我会放到网上。
好的好的，
把网页
发给你。谢谢你啊。When you come back to show us and let me know.
That would be great. I would love to see it.
不好意思，我其实你没来，来讲什么？ 半九秋了啊，说的很好，说的很好。我有个同学，我有个学生在交大，有机会我会来，感谢你，大家好。
Well, actually, was